Welcome to the Sports Geek Podcast, episode 96. This week, Brian Costello from the Portland Timbers on activating the Timbers Army in the stadium and online.
Welcome to the Sports Geek Podcast, the podcast built for sports digital and sports business professionals. And now, here's your host, currently holding his phone up to get a better signal, Sean Callanan.
Thanks, DJ Joel. Yes, I am always holding up my phone to get a better signal. My name is Sean Callanan, and you're listening to the Sports Geek Podcast, either on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or Pocket Casts. Thank you very much for listening. As you heard earlier, this is episode 96. So if you're finding me for the first time, please send me a tweet at Sean Callanan or Sean at sportsgeekhq.com, and please go into the back catalogue, like Nick Barber did recently when he found the podcast and started going through the back catalogue and following all the guests. I think that's a terrific thing to do. Send a tweet to the guests that you are listening to as you're listening to the podcast. I really appreciate it. This week I catch up with Brian Costello from the Portland Timbers. As you've heard in the last couple of episodes, we visited Portland in our trip prior to seat, and we're lucky enough to catch up with the guys at Providence Park. So I catch up with Brian to talk about his role at the Timbers, what they look to do from a digital point of view, and his role as digital editor, and also working with the Timbers, the Thorns, and the Timbers 2, their secondary team. And he has been there since the beginning, so we'll sort of understand how the MLS has evolved over that time. And then later in the episode, I'll look at my question of the week and a few other things. But now let's get stuck into the interview with Brian Costello from the Portland Timbers. Very happy to introduce Brian Costello, Director of Digital Media, Editor-in-Chief at the Portland Timbers, to the Sports Geek Podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, thanks. A big thank you for hosting us in Portland recently. We trekked up there before seat. It was great to check out all things around Providence Park, and because it's such a great little intimate venue. I can only imagine when the Timber Army is in there, how loud that venue gets.
Yeah, no, it's that would if there was a one flaw to your visit, it was that it didn't quite work out to catch a match while you were here. But yeah, it's a pretty special place for sure.
And I think when we were getting the tour, even Pelé played there in his later years.
Yeah, no, I mean, the one of the nice things about this stadium, especially in comparison to other MLS stadiums, it's the oldest field in the league. It was built in 1926, and it's had American football, it's had soccer, it's had track and field, it's had dog racing, and then in the NASL era in the 70s, that's where the Timbers first began, and Pele played for the Cosmos in one of his last match as a professional, which was the Soccer Bowl, and the place was packed with fans, and there's a lot of different random. I mean, Elvis Presley played here. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting little nooks and crannies and historical elements to the place that really give it a lot of character.
So I want to go a little bit on your background. You started at the Timbers before they started playing, while they're in those formative stages back in 2010. You've just clocked up 5 years with the Timbers. Do you want to take us back to, what the team was like and what it was like in those pre-launch sort of days?
Yeah, I mean, I came into the club after doing a lot of different things. I worked in independent filmmaking in New York City for a while on a number of films. I worked in contemporary art. I was a copywriter as well, and in that period too, I was also sort of beginning about 2005, 2006. I really started following the Timbers, which then was in the A-League / USL USL, basically the second division at the time in American soccer, and really got hooked on the team and the environment and the Timbers Army, which had also begun when the team sort of was reborn in 2001. And I was writing about the club at the time, and ended up getting hired that summer of 2010 to, among other things, in my role, I really see it as getting to tell the story of the club, right? So write stories, help edit stories, work with writers, work on videos, all those kinds of things. And that first year was really interesting transition between what was a great environment and fan base for USL soccer into becoming something even larger and even more dynamic on an MLS level. And there was a lot of different things that really clicked that first year with fans and with the team, and how we marketed the club, and how the improvements we made to the stadium. As I say, it's an old stadium, but we also put built a whole new side in the stadium with luxury suites in the club, and all the other sort of pool bells and whistles. So I mean, it was a huge change from where it was in a very short period of time, and ended up having a very large impact in the city, and it's still having one. I mean, it's still growing for sure. 5 years in.
I think it's really, interesting, you coming from a really strong editorial journalistic background, very similar to, our mutual friend Rich Clark, who's now at the Colorado Rapids, where you're all about telling the story, you're all about reporting it first. Like we see, digital departments have been spawned in the last 8 to 10 years, and some have come from the techie geeky side, like myself, and others have come from a marketing side. You've still got that strong, journalistic tendency in everything that you're doing with the Timbers.
Yeah, no, and I think, when I was coming on, MLS was deeply involved with each of the clubs in helping design and work with the clubs on the club sites, and really helping clubs push for someone to lead the digital space at individual club levels, and it's sort of transitioned. I think initially a lot of that role was of a more technical background, and when I came in, one of my things was like, hey, look, I am not a coder. I can figure my way around some HTML, and then I can also figure out how to break it. But what I do know, and what I've always had a passion for, was telling stories, and that's what was wanted and needed here, and I think that is become also something that you see, as you said, has become a larger element for all kinds of sports teams all over the place, finding ways to tell stories that engage fans in new and interesting ways. And, you also, one of the great things here is, like, we have some of the best access. We have the best access of anyone, right? Because we're here. So we can really share and build and create really interesting narratives.
And the thing is, I guess, the way that you go about telling stories, again, if we went back to 2010 and the platforms that were available to now, we've seen a renaissance of long form, things like Medium and that are now allowing people to write longer form, grantland.com and things like that, where people want to consume long form written stuff. But then we've also got this visual storytelling, and the fact that video is just completely blowing up over the last, 2 to 3 years, where more and more teams are providing these, killer stories behind the scenes, tell the story. Like when you've got something like the Timbers Army, as well as all the access to the players, the appetite for it is insatiable. How have you found yourself as a storyteller sort of moving from the written form to more visual forms? And I guess, how have you built out your team to satisfy that need? Yeah, no, and I think there's been a whole host of adjustments and developments since I've been here. I mean, the team is still very lean. We've grown in bits and places, and we have a staff writer. I write a lot of stuff. We have a social media coordinator, and a lot of it too is balancing what
what type of content goes where, what's best for that story too. So sometimes there's a piece that we're, hey, let's have a really engaging player take over a Snapchat account versus another initiative that I've been working on a lot this year is a special collaboration we've been doing with Howler on a series of long form pieces, like you say, that dive into different elements of the club and team history. And I think it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all. It's what's the best tool to use to tell this story. And, like when I started, like Instagram didn't really exist. Vine didn't exist. Periscope, Snapchat, those are all things that have come on strong in the last 5 years. I mean, we had Facebook and Twitter, and even those pieces were things that we were using and utilizing, but a lot of that was very much as a way to help get the word out about things we were doing and stories we were telling, and we still obviously use them for that, but now there's much more interaction with them as well, between communicating with fans and replying to fans and finding ways to build a conversation around the story.
And so, I mean, what are some of the key metrics? Like, a lot of times when I'm talking to teams but then talking to executives, they're still sometimes looking at the vanity metrics or looking at what the website's doing. But if you're doing, pushing out videos on Facebook and they're doing really well, but it's not necessarily driving traffic back, how do you balance that engaging and pushing your content on social with, hey, we need to keep our page views and time on site on the website? How do you define that balance?
Yeah, I mean, that's a deep question. I mean, there's, time on site is a tricky one because also so much more of traffic is mobile, or is coming from mobile, right? Versus just the desktop. And we just actually the club site went through a major overhaul in July to make it responsive for mobile and tablet design, which is definitely a part of that, a reaction to more and more people being on their phones and consuming content. So, you kind of, I think, you work with the metrics to fit. You find the metrics that fit what you're trying to do, because sometimes you're like, I know this piece, I want this. If it's a long form piece, it's going to live on the desktop, and you're hoping that brings a lot of people to that. Versus, hey, this is this cool little fun video that we did after training. It's not long enough to necessarily be its own standalone, but it's a great piece for Twitter or Facebook. And if we put it up there, then we're looking at the metrics of what's the engagement on this, how many likes did it get, how many retweets did it get. So it really depends, I think, on what the piece is and how you define it, and then that helps define what type of success metric you want to assign it. And there's things that you think you're like, oh, this is going to kill here, and then you're like, well, maybe that didn't work as well as we thought it did. Or on the flip side, you're like, you put something quick out, and you're like, wow, that was way more effective on that platform than I expected it to be. So it's a constant balancing act, I think.
And it's something you sort of can't predict either. You don't get to decide what type of fans consume what content on what platform. Like, to a certain degree, it's user voted in that sense.
And we've also had the interesting challenge of, we have the Timbers, which have been a great success story, but we also have the Thorns FC on the women's side, and those are two similar but also different audiences and demographically different, and how they engage on social media is also different. And certain platforms are more engaging, say for Instagram for the Thorns than necessarily as a percentage than necessarily for the Timbers on Instagram. So it's kind of interesting, like, okay, well, what pieces do we put and what voice do we put to different clubs that we're helping oversee?
Yeah, I think that's really important, because you have got the two or the three properties. If we're also looking at the second team of the Timbers, is that when you're pushing out the content, you can't just be pushing out content that the Timbers army will love, because that they'll always love that insider access. You've also got to embrace the wider Portland community, the ones that aren't coming to every game. You've got, I think it's 13,500 season tickets holders, capped for the stadium. But you're also rotating those tickets through to make sure everyone gets a piece of Timbers and comes along to see a game. You've got to push that content out for those people as well, and not just go with your avid fans in the Timbers army, because that they'll love it. You've got to diversify your content in that space.
For sure, I think that's a great point, and it is something that, as successful as we've been with both clubs, we also know that there's still a lot of people who are coming into the team for the first time, whether it's the Timbers or Thorns. And, the Portland Trailblazers, which is the NBA club here, has been around just a little bit longer than we have, and has a lot more in terms of going back to the NASL area. I mean, they've been around 40-some years. Technically, we've been around 40-some years, but we sort of ebbed and flowed a little bit in our existence. But the Blazers have a big footprint here, as do, say, the Oregon Ducks in college football, especially. They've been in the national championship race. So those kinds of things, and where we fall within that is still very strong, but there's still a whole lot of room for growth. And as you say, then finding avenues for where that content goes and what audience it's trying to attract is a little bit different from time to time. I mean, there's different age groups, there's different levels of there's different knowledge of the team and where they're coming from. So at different genders, I mean, all sorts of different elements that come into play, and you try to hit as many of them as you can, and I think hopefully we've done a pretty good job of that. But there's lots of room to still grow.
One of the campaigns that we were really impressed with at Providence Park was the fan photos with the axe. I can only just imagine the waivers and the legal teams, in this political correctness world, handing over a giant axe to fans. It could have gone.
Here's a spoiler: they are prop axes. They were not real axes.
Don't ruin it, Brian. Don't ruin it. But I mean, I'll share some of the photos, but. Because that's a campaign that's it's been a long running campaign. It's been run a couple of times. The fans always get around. It always comes up with great emotive shots to because sports is all about identity, and fans really want to identify with. How has that campaign both gone initially, but then always been refreshed along the way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting thing, and that was a campaign that was sort of in the works right when I first began, and our marketing team here, Corey Dolich is our VP of marketing. He really helped lead that with a local ad partner, and it initially started as going into that first season and trying to sell season tickets. We had photos of some select fans that we had found and took portraits of, and we put them on the sides of buildings, like 6-7 stories tall type billboards, if you will, that were just plastered all over the city with just the date and the crest, and people started building up knowledge of, hey, this is coming, hey, I got to find out more. There wasn't even a website on the ads. There wasn't a phone number. People just saw them and were like, oh, that's the Timbers. I need to start paying attention to that. And it started building this interest in it, and season ticket sales started selling out, and the word of mouth and buzz really started spreading. And then part of that we said, well, hey, what if we did something where we allowed fans to come in and have because the portraits were so popular, we wanted to open it up to more fans to come in and have those pictures taken how they wanted with their own stuff. And so they arrived with we had long lines, and we set up in a temporary team store that we'd set up downtown, and people came and they took their photos, and initially it was meant that, hey, we'll use these for social media handles, right, for Twitter and Facebook, and so they got shared all over the place, and people were like, wow, that was really cool. And then even after that first year, people were like, oh, I really wish they did it again. Well, this is our 5th year anniversary since joining MLS. I said, hey, we're going to bring it back. And one of the cool things we did is, we went back. I had done interviews that first year with some of the models and some of the fans that were part of that first campaign, and went back and visited with them again to see what had changed over the last 5 years, and made stories and content about how their fandom had changed. In some cases, the pictures were amazing, because you see ones that were like, a 9-year-old girl is now 16, right? And so you can see literally a height change in some of the fans, and others where it was like a couple in one, and now they have 2 kids, right? So the fans really got into it, because then they came back and took another portrait, and you could see how the fans aged and changed and became closer to the club. And then, this time around, because it was so successful the first time, everybody's like, well, I got to get in this time. And the lines would like be 3 hours long, right? We did it over the course of like 3 different weekends, and we opened it up. We did a special shoot with a lot of the players and their families, and it became sort of the signature element. And the ones that were taken from the first year, the first time around, we put up into the stadium in a permanent poster, plaque, if you will. And then we've made another one that from this year that has also gone up in another part of the stadium. So fans come and they see those, and they know that the connection to what the club is and the ongoing sort of history of it becomes very real for them, because they really feel part of it. And it's the kind of thing where, like, 5 years from now, I bet we'll do it again. It's an interesting way to help mark the passage of time and the growth of the club.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where Corey's done a great job in helping form the identity of the club really quick, but really also just locking in those fans. Like, those fans have got a photo there; they're not going anywhere, and they're going to start lining up for the photo shoot in 4 years' time. And
they're not going anywhere, but we still need to work to make sure we keep them, a part of the family, if you will. I mean, it's something that we love the engagement, and we love the fandom, but we also I take a great sense of responsibility that we're sort of stewards of this club in the time that we're here, and there's a lot of work to keep those fans interested and engaged, and ideally a lot of that comes from performance on the field, but there's a lot of other steps to that too, and I think all of us here feel a big responsibility to keep those fans feeling part of the club.
I don't normally do this, but I sent off a tweet before we jumped on our call, and I've actually got Mark Cleary at Mark P. Cleary on Twitter send through a question, and he was asking, how do you report Snapchat success? How in your initial playing with Snapchat, what's some of the key signs that you're doing a good job?
Well, it's a tricky question. I think it's a new platform for us. We did not jump in on it right away. We had a lot of debates internally about what we would want to do with it and how we used it and which clubs we used it with. It's still very new for us, and I think we're still experimenting with what we can do with it and how we measure the success with it. So I don't know if that I have the best answer to that question. I saw it on Twitter here pop up as well.
I think it is. So, I mean, I agree with you, and with Mark, it's so early. Like, I mean, you can go and open up and see how many engagements you've had, but it's almost like you need to start getting feedback from fans on whether they're liking it and that you're getting growth on your account. I think the unique thing for Snapchat is that it provides a story in the correct order. Every other platform provides it backwards, whereas you've got a really good way with Snapchat to tell the whole story of a day at Providence Park. It can be here, they're arriving, Joey's oiling his chainsaw, the guys are warming up, there's, here's the crowds going off, and it can really give this is what a day at the stadium is like. And I don't think there's any other platform that can do that. I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I think when we looked at like different platforms like that, we're always trying to figure out, because we have so many different teams and so many different platforms that come with it, we're like, okay, well, what do we want to use this platform for? How would we use it? What kind of stories would we tell in it? And not only that, how do we maintain that presence? Because we don't want to just start it and then be like, oh, this is cool and shiny, and then kind of be like, oh, no, we're bored with it, right? Because then that doesn't work either, right? But I think with Snapchat, that was something we thought long and hard about before we got into that. And when our social media coordinator, Dane Carbaugh, sort of explored what it would be, he really teased it out over time using other social media channels, saying, hey, this is coming, take a look, be ready for it, we're going to do some cool stuff in it. So that when it hit, the fans that were already attuned to Snapchat, which is obviously a sweet spot of young millennial fans, were ready for it, and we did some cool things with it right off the bat that got fans, really connected. We did one last week. We handed it to one of our forwards
and sort of he took it for the day, the account, and did everything from like getting up in the morning, going to training, showing treatment, going after training, hanging out with a friend. I mean, he really had a great time with it, and was a good choice to do with it. This was Maxi Urruti, who was one of our forwards. Fans got really engaged because they saw, as you say, a story from beginning to end in an order that was also creative, that was fun, and that showed stuff that people don't normally get to see. And in that sense, it can be a great tool. So, like I said, I think we're still experimenting, and we're still experimenting how we measure that success too, because it's still a very new platform and tool for us.
Yeah, and it is, and like you said earlier, you can't just go, the stuff we're doing over here, we're going to do over here as well. It's a completely new platform. It's consumed differently. It's got a different audience. I'm hoping, and this is in the short conversations I've had with Snapchat, I'm hoping that they open up the Snapchat story for your stadium to the teams that run the stadium. That's, to me, that's the power of Snapchat. When you go to a big event, and I've told the story of me going to WrestleMania, seeing everybody's snaps from WrestleMania made for a completely different story that no one else was telling.
Yeah, and the league actually did something with Snapchat and us and Seattle when we played our game early in the season in the spring, our first game on the road against Seattle. So big, huge rivalry game, right? They did that location geo target around that for Snapchat. So there was stuff from the team accounts for sure, and the MLS account, but then there was loads of stuff from fans from both sides too. They did a really good job of curating interesting pieces so you could see different sides to the story from literally different perspectives in the building, which was really cool, and I like that. I like that way of using that tool, I think.
Well, thank you very much for joining me, Brian. People can find you on Twitter, BA Costello on Twitter.
Correct.
So send Brian a tweet, tell him that you're listening to the podcast, and if you're ever in Portland, send him a tweet and tell him you're in town. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sign up for Sports Geek News at sportsgeekhq.com/sign up now.
Thanks, Brian. And as I said there, you can send Brian a tweet, BA Costello, on Twitter. Please send him a tweet. Tell him you've listened. And please leave an iTunes review if you feel so inclined. Getting closer and closer to the 100 iTunes reviews mark. I'm trying to get there before we get to episode 100. So if you could leave an iTunes review, simply go to sportsgeekhq.com/iTunes. Don't forget, you can see all the show notes, all the links to Brian, and a few links to the Portland Timbers content by simply going to sportsgeekhq.com/96, as you can with every single episode. The same that you can go and check back the Russell Scabetti episode on developing CRM, and I'm still running the comments competition. So if you think you've got a witty or a pithy response to what Russell is thinking in the photo on episode 94, please enter. We're going to close off the entries on August 30, and someone's going to win a Sports Geek t-shirt. So please go to sportsgeekhq.com/94. Until then, you can contact me, Sean, S-E-A-N, at sportsgeekhq.com. Let me know if there's any way that we can help you with your digital output, working with your digital team, working with your commercial team, understanding the value of what you're trying to do, looking to sell more tickets, understanding the opportunities in Facebook advertising and things like that. They're the things that I've been doing on a regular basis with all my clients. If you need help in that space, please send me an email or send me a tweet, and we'll set up a time. This week's episode question, and please send me a tweet. I did have a little bit of a rant on this topic on the Sports Geek Facebook page, facebook.com/sportsgeek. There's an article that came out that said, first of all, it said that brands are paying, and then it sort of refined that to say this is what it's worth. And it put the value of a LeBron James tweet at $140,000 $140,000. Now, part of me is a bit of a cynic, thinking that they've gone 140,000 because there's 140 characters. It's a nice little play for the journalists. But it's effectively saying that it's worth $140,000 for a brand to get a mention on a LeBron tweet. And even though LeBron has tremendous follower numbers, 23 million, I think at last count, for mine, I don't see the value in a brand dropping $140,000 on a single tweet from LeBron. It really comes back to some of the discussions that we had at Seat around, I guess, the mentalities of brands seeing a big number and saying, hey, we want to put out a post, we want to pay to be on that team page, or in this case, that athlete page, and a single post won't do it. It has to be an integrated campaign. So, I mean, I quickly looked at LeBron's feed, and he'd sent out a tweet about USA Today promoting his foundation, and that had I think it was 23,000 hits. Now, if we attribute every single hit to LeBron, that's $6 a click. And but in some industries that's a great return. But if I'm looking at what value can I get from $140,000, I know I can deliver far greater reach, far greater results. Not so much reach, far greater results with a $140K budget using digital means than just one tweet that is gone, is not reusable, is a once-off thing, is not in the public sphere after 4 or 5 minutes, really, even with all the retweets. So, yeah, I really question that the land rush that is influencer marketing, and there's a lot of people that are getting paid big bucks to post Instagrams or post tweets with big following. The thing I'd be looking at, I think that's just lazy marketers for mine in looking at the big numbers. They're not really getting the results. And as a team, if you're just selling a post, and whether this is talking to the commercial guys in your teams, it's not going to get the value. It really has to be a fully integrated campaign. Do I think that there's an opportunity with the social presence that a LeBron James has? Absolutely. But putting the worth of a tweet or selling a tweet for a single tweet for $140,000, I don't think that works. Now, that's different to putting a value on it and using it, but buying and selling it as a single entity, I just don't see it. I think there's far more opportunities and far better ways for brands to spend their money. So, what's your take? Is a LeBron tweet worth 140 characters? Send me a tweet at Sean Callanan, SeanCallanAN, or if you can't remember how to spell my name, you can simply say at SportsGeek, and that will also find me. Thanks again to everyone who has left a review. Love seeing them come in from around the world. I'm going to finish this podcast. Have a tune in after DJ Joel finishes off things with closing with the sounds of the game from a New York City. Unfortunately, weren't able to go to a Timbers game, but we were lucky enough to go to see New York City FC at Yankee Stadium, and this is the New York City fans in Yankee Stadium, and you can hear the build-up as they rebound a Kaká free kick, and Pirlo and David Villa combine to see a goal scored at the other end, and you can hear the crescendo of the fans to get the victory for New York City FC. Thanks to Jane Busman Wise from New York City for getting us tickets to that game. Until next week, my name is Sean Callanan, and you have been listening to the Sports Geek Podcast.
Like the Sports Geek Podcast? Find us on Facebook.com/SportsGeek. Check out which teams work with Sports Geek at SportsGeekHQ.com/clients. Please leave a review on iTunes. Go to SportsGeekHQ.com/iTunes.